moment. I can't believe it. Janet, I don't think I've ever asked you how to pronounce your last name. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Oh, that's wonderful. Oh, you have no idea the drama going on here about trying to get a working computer. My last name is pronounced Phelan. Okay. And I'm just loading up a video. I'm going to be all ready in about 2 seconds here. Okay. I want to thank you very much for inviting me to present today. I want to start off by focusing on the fact that even though we've gotten scant media attention to this, we actually have an ongoing human rights crisis in the United States. And I'm going to tick off just briefly a few ways that this crisis is manifesting, and then I'm going to go into something more actually focused on the topic as to what happens when we attempt to go to first to domestic venues to help resolve the crisis, and then why it is increasingly becoming necessary to seek justice abroad, or at least this is the perception that a lot of us are having. The ongoing human rights crisis in the U.S. is manifesting itself, first of all, when police kill unarmed citizens, usually people of color or mentally ill, and there is no culpability. There are no repercussions for the involved officer. The human rights crisis in the U.S. also manifests when in court-authorized adult guardianships. Adult guardianships, for those who are not particularly aware of this process, are generally launched through a court when there are allegations that a person is lacking capacity and cannot make his own decisions. And unfortunately, the level of proof that is requested by judges in these cases is very, very slim. And upon initiation of the guardianship, the alleged incapacitated person will lose all their rights. They will lose all access to their assets, and they will often lose the ability to make any contact with family members. The guardian decides whether or not family will be able to have any input or visit or whatever with the alleged incapacitated person. And should a family member become concerned and protective, it is very oftenly seen that the court will issue stay-away orders. They will issue gag orders on the concerned family. Cases where they will be jailed on entirely contempt of court for failure to pay court costs. So we have a growing number of victims of these adult guardianship proceedings, and we also have a number of grassroots groups which have sprung up across the country in an attempt to help kind of muddle our way through what's happening to our loved ones, our elders and family members under these guardianships. The human rights crisis in the U.S. also manifests in family court, where children are often, ill children are often taken away from perfectly adequate parents to be put into pharmaceutical trial programs. There's a lot more I could say on that, but I'm just sort of ticking them off right now. The human rights crisis in the U.S. also manifests itself in repeated attempts to criminalize and jail whistleblowers, such as ex-CIA John Kiriakou, ex-NSA Karen Melton Stewart, and the ex-CIA asset Susan Lindauer. We can just go through a number of other names here, but this is basically a situation where whistleblowers are finding themselves held in criminal proceedings, some of which have absolutely no validity whatsoever. We're also seeing now, as another very shocking manifestation of the ongoing human rights crisis in the U.S., we're seeing an avalanche of reports from everyday citizens that they are being placed in non-consensual weapons testing programs, not only directed energy, but biological and chemical weapons programs. In fact, I do believe that one of these cases made it into the courts. This is the Edgewood Vets testing situation, and unfortunately the courts did not adjudicate this in a way that was particularly helpful to those former soldiers who were non-consensually placed in weapons testing programs. So all these issues should, by their very nature, be dealt with by the legal system. Unfortunately, we are now seeing a crisis in judicial integrity in the U.S., and this crisis is gravely impacting the success of efforts to appropriately adjudicate the manifestations of this crisis. I'm going to try to play here a brief interview that was aired on Russia Today that has to do with the nature of this crisis. And I hope that I'm going to be able to do the screen share here. Let's see. You're going to have to tell me if this is...
Let me see. I may have to make you a co-host. Wait 1 second.
Scandal on the bench. Here it is. Here it is.
Okay, go ahead.
Do you have this?
What is it?
No, we don't have any.
We don't have it. I made you a co-host. Can you try it again? Because that might be necessary. We're not seeing your screen.
How about now?
Now we can. We're not hearing.
You're not hearing?
No, we can see it, but we can't hear.
Okay, that's a shame.
Oh, yeah. Maybe refresh that screen.
Okay, let me just try it one more time, and if it doesn't work, I'll summarize because it's a short interview, and okay, let's see. Just try it one more time. No, this isn't going to work. Okay, briefly, this was an interview that took place on Russia Today last year, which focused on revelations that per appearances, judges are laundering bribes and payoffs, specifically through their home loans. And there have been a number of articles written on this. This particular interview was about 5 minutes, and it really summarized the evidence. Essentially, I first became aware of the possibility that that loans could be considered problematic through my father's work. He was an investigative reporter, and he published an article in the old Reporter magazine at the time that Richard Nixon was running for the California governor's seat against Pat Brown. And the article in the Reporter discussed a very problematic loan that had been made by Howard Hughes to Dick Nixon's brother, Donald. And as a result of this article, Pat Brown, who won the California gubernatorial election, publicly credited this article with turning the tide of the election for him. So when I began to look at first at probate court judges who were making these really bizarre decisions, keeping family away from loved ones, approving accountings which appeared to be nonsensical and only resulted in enriching the guardian and the attorneys. So I started looking at the probate court judges originally in San Bernardino County. I was at that point writing for the San Bernardino County Sentinel, which was an investigative reporting weekly hard copy venue in San Bernardino. And I was quite alarmed at what I saw, because the judges in San Bernardino, a number of them were taking out far more money in loans, in home loans, than they could possibly pay back on a judge's salary. They were paying them back very quickly, taking out more loans. You see this cyclical effort. And when I began to question this in San Bernardino, I began to see responses by the judges that were redolent of guilt. For example, there was a judge questioned actually in Riverside. A letter was faxed into the presiding judge's office on a Commissioner Michael McCoy, who was making very strange decisions in guardianship cases, and McCoy immediately stepped down from the case that prompted the inquiry. What we saw in San Bernardino, the chief probate court judge there, name was Mike Welch, and he resigned the bench. And case after case where judges who have been taking out excessive loans are questioned about this, we see them either stepping down from the cases which prompted the inquiry, or in more and more cases we see them leaving the bench. So we cannot at this point in time prove, we don't have access to the judge's bank accounts. All we see is activity that is extremely suspicious, and we see the responses by the judges when questioned that is not a satisfactory, non-guilty kind of response. So based on this, I actually held a seminar last year and trained about 50 people in doing this research. And we have people over the country now doing the research on the judges with the same sort of response that I was seeing. So that is sort of the summary of the interview with Sean Stone on Russia Today. What we're seeing is that roughly 2/3 of the judges checked have mortgage histories that are redolent of money laundering. That's an awful lot. In addition, I'm aware that there are some other mechanisms that are possible and apparently are being used to pay off judges. According to a retired attorney in Illinois, judges are being paid off with nursing home beds. So whatever money goes into, whoever is occupying that bed, a certain percentage of that money is going to pay off members of the legal profession. There were also some concerns going on in Las Vegas, this was the sort of the focus of the Russia Today interview. There was some concerns going on in Vegas about a particular commissioner and his activity in casinos. Nevertheless, it would make sense that if judges are going to make brazenly unconstitutional and illegal decisions on the bench, and we know that with judicial immunity, it's almost impossible to sue a judge, that if they're going to advance certain agendas, certain sorts of deprivations of rights, you can be pretty sure they're going to be paid off to do it. So this is one of our major concerns now about the evidence of the crisis in judicial integrity. And due to what everyday citizens are encountering now in these court cases, more and more individuals and groups are seeking justice abroad. And I'd like to spend the rest of my presentation kind of discussing what I personally have witnessed in terms of these efforts. I'm not only a journalist, I also chair an NGO called ITHACA, which was launched around 2010 for the purposes of engaging the United Nations on certain sorts of issues. And one of the first things that ITHACA did was to get involved in the UPR cycles, the Universal Periodic Review of the Human Rights Record of the U.S. As we know, generally speaking, the U.S. does not ratify and sign human rights treaties. And when it does, it generally does so with reservations, which essentially gut any jurisdiction that an international entity might exert over the United States. And in addition, as we know, the U.S. does not honor the International Court at The Hague, nor does it honor the jurisdiction of the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. However, the U.S. has signed and ratified the Convention Against Torture, albeit with reservations. So pursuant to this, ITHACA, the NGO that I chair, filed a report on guardianship abuse with the Special Rapporteur on Torture a couple of years ago. And this particular report was buttressed by over 80 personal declarations of guardianship victims and attorneys. And after it was filed, we never heard another peep. That Special Rapporteur on Torture apparently did nothing. They did nothing. So ITHACA is also, as I mentioned, engaged in 2 UPR cycles of the human rights in the U.S. Our second submission was included in the UN General Compilation Report and also footnoted in that report. At that point, we discovered something rather unusual. I was watching, of course, the stream of the UPR. I was interested in seeing what sort of response the U.S. was giving to the numerous allegations coming not only from NGOs but coming from state parties about concerns about the human rights record. And at that point, I discovered that the U.S. was lying extensively to the international community. This was not hard to ferret out, because in a number of instances, the delegates from the State Department made specific mention of numbers. For example, a James Cadogan, who was with the State Department, made a statement on the record that there had been at least 400 federal prosecutions for police misconduct in the time period that this UPR cycle was addressing. And so that's a number that can be fact-checked. And I not only did, the extensive research, I also checked with a number of professors of human rights in universities. And in fact, the federal prosecutions in that time period for police misconduct were less than 1/2 dozen. Not 400, not 300, not 200, not even 10. There were also statements made on the record concerning the acreage that the U.S. was returning to Native Americans. And the statement was made that 1 million acres had been returned. In fact, the number was 300,000 acres, not 1 million, greatly inflated. Another figure that was greatly inflated was the federal hate crime prosecutions. The delegates to the UN stated on the record that there were 200 such prosecutions. In fact, we could only find 56. So the US was making statements on the record which would add a certain patina to its the public perception of the diligence with which the federal government is safeguarding human rights, and these statements were utterly false. I did contact the UN Human Rights. I wrote an article about this. The article was published in New Eastern Outlook, which is actually the editorial offices for New Eastern Outlook are in Russia. And the article was published, and I contacted the UN Human Rights Council and numerous other parties at the United Nations, and they appeared to be annoyed. They were not interested in pursuing the fact that the US was lying to the UN. They just really didn't want to talk about it. So that was an unfortunate sort of response, I felt. In addition, and we're going to move on a bit now to some of the other efforts that have been made to engage some international concern about the human rights crisis that is going on in the US. And I am aware of a number of contacts made to the larger human rights NGOs concerning individuals and also the thematic concerns. FIDH, Freedom House, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Reporters Without Borders, Article 19, Frontline Defenders. And you can actually go on the websites of these various groups, and they simply there are certain vetted issues. For example, Guantanamo for a while was a very hot issue, and there were a number of human rights organizations that were making efforts to resolve some of the ongoing abuses going on at Guantanamo. That's a vetted issue. But these other issues that we have brought up earlier in this this conversation are simply not considered to be something that any of these organizations will take on. And in fact, there has been some active efforts to ensure that their attention goes to human rights abuses in countries that are considered to be problematic for the U.S. For example, if you go to the website for Frontline Defenders, they take on cases and they attempt to resolve abuses against specific human rights defenders. And the last time I checked their website, which actually was a few months ago, you would see reporters and human rights defenders from Syria, from Russia, from China. And the last time I checked, there was not one human rights defender from the Western world who was featured as getting any sort of attention from Frontline Defenders. And I do know that they have been contacted repeatedly because there are more and more American citizens who are running into problems with their constitutional rights, their human rights being honored in the U.S. But these organizations appear to be favoring countries, the plight of human rights defenders in countries that the U.S. doesn't like. And also, if one does some research on who funds these organizations, you will generally see that they are, at least in part, funded by the U.S. State Department. There are also similar issues that are arising with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. which is the human rights arm of the Organization of American States. I know personally of 2 reports that have gone into the IACHR requesting precautionary measures, and those are emergency requests for U.S. citizens due to fallout from an adult guardianship case. One of the requests that went into the IACHR was actually mine. I'm appearing here by video link as I fled the U.S. and am currently in Latin America. And I fled the U.S. not because I was threatened. I fled the U.S. because I was physically assaulted by the police. I was hospitalized and unconscious for a number of days. The IACHR held on to my emergency request for precautionary measures for over a year. And when there began to be letters going into the IACHR from a number, International Federation of Journalists, Ecoterra, a bunch of human rights groups asking why they simply weren't responding, my request was denied with no investigation and no reason given. More recently, actually a year ago, a request for precautionary measures was entered on behalf of an elderly man in California named Leon Bridges. Leon Bridges is under an adult guardianship, and the judge in this matter, a Los Angeles Superior Court judge named David Cowan, was advised by his own court investigator that the individual who was applying for the guardianship had actually already stolen $80,000 from Mr. Bridges, at which point the judge immediately appointed the thief as guardian. And the request for precautionary measures was put in by family because they don't even know where he is. They cannot contact their father. They don't know anything about his whereabouts. And this particular case has been pending. The request for emergency measures has been pending at the IACHR for over a year. There's been no response whatsoever from the group. So I went ahead and I did some research on the sole IACHR commissioner. At the time that I had made my request, the sole IACHR commissioner from the U.S. Was named James Caballero. He's a Stanford law professor. I believe his term has expired and he's not with the IACHR anymore. However, I'm trying to see if I can possibly minimize this. Yeah, I'm just going to put his loan history up here on the screen. I hope you'll be able to see it because it's rather shocking. This was culled from the Santa Clara County. Come on, you can do it. Yeah, this was culled from the Santa Clara County Grantor-Grantee Index. And you can see, I hope you can see. Let me see. Open now. All right, is this up there or not?
Not yet.
You don't have it. Let me see if there's something else I need to do here to screen share. Okay, is it up here now?
Yes, it's coming.
I'm sorry?
Yes, we see it.
Okay. Let me just move this down a bit. Well, there's 14 transactions during this particular period that Caballero was a commissioner with the IACHR. And I had noted, I went ahead and grabbed this off the Grantor-Grantee Index, and I had noted that his loan history prior to joining the IACHR, I believe there was like 2 entries Yeah, you can see during the period of time he was with the ICHR, there was 14. And when I went back to the grantor-grantee index to take down the evidence of the explosion in loans and reconveyances at the time Caballero joined the ICHR, when I went back, I found that all of his information had been scrubbed. You can't find anything on Caballero anymore. So, you know, we have concerns that that not only are judges being paid off through this particular mechanism to possibly throw cases, we're also concerned that members of the international human rights community may have become similarly compromised and corrupted. There was a response to these concerns. They were sent into the head guy at the ICHR, Dr. Paulo Abreu, and his sole response was, James Caballero is no longer with us. He had no other comment. There was also a request made to Dr. Abreu for his financial records, and he declined to produce them. So I'm gonna wrap up now. In conclusion, it does appear that the international response to the U.S. human rights crisis echoes similar mechanisms of what we see happening in the U.S. In the U.S., we see a failure to enforce existing laws, and on the international scene, we also see a failure to enforce international accords. Some of this, of course, is due to the U.S.'s own failure to ratify and sign different instruments, but we also see a similar level of indifference that is evidenced by the international agencies and organizations, similar to what we see when we go to the legal system in the U.S. when we file police reports about, you know, like what happened to Leon Bridges. Believe me, police reports have been filed, missing persons reports have been filed, and there's simply, and what we see is a rather shocking level of indifference, and unfortunately we're also seeing this in the international agencies and organizations. There's not a lack of international accords, just as there is not a lack of domestic laws which should be able to protect citizens. There's instead a failure to enforce the laws and the accords. And we also are concerned that we're seeing the very same mechanisms to corrupt international officials that appear to have corrupted the judiciary. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say. And if there's any questions, any discussion?
It looks like it's not any questions or comments, Janet. We received your information, your presentation, and appreciate it. And I think that it's a perfect note to end today's conference